everybody for being here. My name is Helen Del Giudice, and I'm the curator of exhibitions and collections here at the Miller Art Museum. And this program is the Studio Door. And today I sit down in conversation with artist Brandon Bauer, and we're going to be discussing his exhibit that's on display around you, Landscapes of Absence. We'll also be talking about Fragments of the Acceleration a little bit, and all kinds of incredible topics. So Brandon, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Brandon is an associate professor of art at St. Norbert's College. So Brandon, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for this exhibit. This exhibit is a little bit different for the Miller. The topics that we're facing here are pretty heavy, and I want to kind of start at the beginning, give us some background about how you as an artist have made the decisions to take on such big, important topics such as terrorist propaganda and the theories of the acceleration and the Anthropocene, and these are big, heavy topics. And what has steered you towards doing that?
Sure. First, I do want to say thank you for inviting me to exhibit here. Thanks to everybody at the Miller who has supported this. I've talked to so many volunteers like mine who've really been engaged and really thinking about how to help people navigate this. Because as you said, I mean, it is different than what has been done at the Miller. It is serious. You know, we've had our conversations where I was like, I know people are coming to Door County to get away from it all. I don't know if they want to, step in and kind of see this. But, to your question, I mean, I've always believed that there's an important role that art must play in addressing, the issues of the time, and whether that is terrorist propaganda or, the climate crisis. Artists have important things to say about that, and important ways of engaging people in those conversations. Some of it is artists can, be world makers and, show different kinds of ways of seeing a topic or an idea that maybe people haven't thought of before. And so it creates a unique space where you can consider things from different perspectives. And so I really have always believed in that value of art.
I mean, artists have a different skill set than other people, right? We have trained in a certain kind of communication that other people don't use on a daily basis. So I feel like we are thinking about things as trained to do so and communicate what we're thinking back in a visual, in a deeply written, there's a philosophy, there's, so I feel like there's a real possibility there of understanding. That's one of the things I love about this exhibit, is that it helped me to understand things that I took for granted that are super serious and really important, and it ends up translating into other areas of the imagery that I'm taking in every day, right? But I want to go back to what you were saying. Do you think that artists have a responsibility? I mean, there's easy art, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of easy art in the world where I can just enjoy it, and I think there's nothing wrong with easy art, But do you think artists have a responsibility to consider their ethical perspective when they approach their artwork?
I do. I mean, that is one of the things that I focus on in my own work, and something that I try to teach my students, to really get them to think about how what they make has an impact in the world. Because artists and designers, we are creating a view of the world. And so we really do need to think about what we're putting out there and what we're saying about it and how we're getting people to engage with those things. And, so much of it, comes down to some of those, as you're talking about, the way that artists are trained, some of those kind of basic, foundational kind of ideas that are instilled, at any level of art education. You can think about a figure drawing class or something like that. What are you doing? You're trained to observe, right? So artists are observers. And then what do you do after that? Well, everybody puts their work up on the wall and you talk about it, you critique. Critique isn't always, like a critical thing. It's about what's working, what's not, how is this communicating an idea? And so those kind of two foundational ideas are embedded in any artist practice. Observe and critique. And so there is that kind of ethical responsibility that comes into that discussion. I mean, there's nothing, as you're saying, you can call it, some work, easy work. There's nothing wrong with making something that's beautiful.
Right.
I mean, beauty is needed,
Yep.
Especially when we're faced with, such gravity of the world. There's a place where we need, beauty. But, we also have to think about, like, it's a message, what are you trying to say? How are you communicating your idea? How does beauty come into, maybe a more serious statement or things like that? So.
Right, because, beauty attaches us to a lot of emotional responses. You can have a really deep emotional response that just happens to you, that you don't have to think about, and you can just enjoy that emotional response. And that's what beauty, to me, offers us, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I put the landscapes that I put upstairs. It offers us a little bit of a healing moment to think about our emotional and spiritual reactions to landscapes after, considering landscapes in this way.
Yeah.
So let's talk about these landscapes in particular for a minute. These are landscapes of absence, and I want you to walk us through, because for me, it's really brilliant. You include these three components, and these are really violent acts, except you don't, we're so used to images that we take in TV, just, emphasizing the graphic or the horrific or the bloody, and you really put a lot of reverence towards the actual, result of violence by, representing the act itself with very subtle lines, and you remove that for us so that we can approach it with reverence, right? So the three elements for me that you've included are the timeline, right? The timeline of actual events where people are, these gross acts of violence happen to them. And then you remove the victim altogether to give us a landscape that is void of the act altogether. And for me, I keep referring to it as a non-consensual participant in the act of violence. So how do you feel about that the landscape could be a non-consensual participant? I mean... Yeah,
and it's interesting. I mean, I think that's a great question. And, when you were writing that language up in some of the promotional materials, I was like, that's a very strange way to frame this. And what my initial interpretation of what you were saying was, that these journalists or aid workers were the non-consensual. I was like, of course they're non-consensual. Like, that's a very weird way to state that.
Right.
Why would they invite that? But I do understand, after conversations, like you're speaking about the landscape itself. And, I think that in some ways that idea does tie to the work that I've been doing relating to the Anthropocene.
Yeah.
And this idea of how we affect the earth and how we, so I think that in that sense, like, there is a real kind of powerful concept in there.
Because the natural environment obviously is an inanimate object that doesn't have the ability to consent or not consent to something.
Yeah.
However, it also doesn't consent to the things that we're doing within that landscape, right?
Yeah.
So if this beautiful beach setting is just the chosen place for a horrific act of violence, but, when we look at violence or when we think about it, the arena in which it is set has a great impact on how the gravity that violence has on us, right? I mean, if it's in a dark closet, it's one thing. If it's out in the woods, it's another. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you could take the same act of violence and put it in a different setting.
Well, and it's interesting too. I teach a number of different classes at St. Norbert, and I was teaching this course called Art, Technology, and Society, and we investigate different ways that artists have adapted new technologies or responded to particular social issues throughout art history. And we had a speaker last semester who is a Lakota artist, and she does all this really fascinating work with artificial intelligence, and she's been writing these like position papers about, you know, making kinship with AI and trying to think about like this new kind of ethics of emerging technologies that comes from Lakota ideas and philosophies. And she was talking about the land as this living being, you know, and so, you know, there are ways to it. If you think about it in those kinds of frames, you know, how do we interact with the land? How do we, you know, make our peace with this living space that, you know, we're only a part of, that is going to, you know, outlast us? And, you know, so it's a very interesting kind of perspective that she was bringing to these ideas of like inanimate objects, rocks, and, you know, things
Right.
like that, but how in their philosophy there are, you know, living beings.
Right, definitely. I think the video where there's one video in the exhibit that has very little imagery. It's a soundtrack, and you do a still by still analysis of the camera angles and the drone position or the on the ground position, pointing out that there have been cinematographic choices made in the documenting of these beheading videos. Tell me a little bit about that, because that really kind of blew my mind a little bit, because we watch these things and we just like accept that it's happening. We're so used to cinematography that we don't even think about like, oh, they edited this and they came in this way and they panned out and they overlaid text and
And I mean, I think that that's really important to understand, you know, kind of the nature of this propaganda, and what ISIS was doing in particular really kind of anticipated many different ways that propaganda is functioning now. And you know, what we're seeing, I mean, all these still images were from videos. These were all videos that were released, and they were highly edited, highly scripted, highly, you know,
Titled.
polished. I mean, titled. They had their own, like, you know, media production companies, and they were created for Western audiences specifically. I mean, they had other videos, like propaganda videos, that were for like internal, for the territories they controlled, that were like showing this like Islamic utopia, and they were like kind of happy and like, oh, children are playing at these parks in these cities that we're taking over, you know, like they were trying to show like we're good government to the internal citizens, but they were showing this to us,
Right.
you know, and I mean they had people who were, you know, highly trained in, you know, these kinds of production things. They had, I mean, there was a video I remember seeing of, you know, this German rapper who was, you know, had like converted to Islam and went to, you know, go and participate in the caliphate, and he like, you know, did this like tour of the city, and like, look at, isn't this great, you know, like, so they were also recruiting people, you know, trying to get people,
hiring actors.
yeah, exactly,
Getting role models.
yeah, hiring influencers, you know, and things like that. So I mean, it was, their propaganda machine was really sophisticated, and the ways in which they disseminated it were really sophisticated. They used this technique that has been now called hashtag hijacking, where they would like take over trending hashtags and insert their work into those streams of information, and, you know, but all these techniques have been, you know, taken on since then. So I mean, it was a highly sophisticated, you know, kind of operation, and I wanted to show that in that, you know, again,
Right.
taking out the graphic violence, taking out the aspect of propaganda that they're trying to, you know, show us.
The part they think is successful.
And
That is
just
successful
show
for
that
them.
this is highly constructed, crafted, well thought out. And up until this point, I mean, there were beheading videos by, you know, terrorists, you know, before
Right.
this, but they were all like really crudely shot and, you know, not considered, not, You know, they were not trying to.
In a hideout somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
With a black sheep pinned to the wall.
Yes. You know, so they were trying, and they were operating. They were doing these in these open landscapes to try to say, hey, listen, we've got control of this whole area.
Right.
You know, it was a visual way to craft their message specifically for us,
Right.
you know, to consume.
And that's one of the things about looking at the landscape is that it gives you the impression that this is a vast territory and there's no way in. Like we can't cross those mountains and survive. We can't get onto this shore safely. Like they own this vast territory, which is not really true, right? That's, you know, but that's typical of propaganda. It's self-aggrandizement, right? And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the fact that the way the timeline of war imagery has moved in general, right? So you have, you know, World War I and World War II, you know, all footage was in black and white. It wasn't streaming into the home. It was either printed in the newspaper or you had to go to like a cinema and watch newsreels. Right, and then that moves along, that system moves along until we get televisions in the home. And then you're talking about Korea, but even post-Korea, and the Vietnam War. Like, so the Vietnam War is the first American-involved war that comes streaming in real time into the home to consume. And you have a video that's in the West Gallery, The War at Home. And so I've been thinking about that a lot, about like when our consciousness, and I was born in '68, so I grew up with war streaming into the home and Vietnam vets coming home when I was a little girl, and the way, you know, people were reacting to that, and that whole at-home trial that went on with the Vietnam War. So really, we move forward and we're in the Gulf Wars, then the external enemy kind of, you know, is no longer Asia per se, it's you know, the Arab world, you know, the sand dunes, like the wars on the sand dunes. And so what happened in that shift is that, do you think that is like a part of this development, this acceleration into masterful propaganda when it comes to organizations like ISIS?
Well, I think that, you know, it's, as you're talking about kind of painting that timeline, I mean, you have to think about, you know, the kind of emerging media that was happening at some of these different places. You know, I mean, one of the main, you know, channels that became, you know, really effective for propaganda during the 30s and run up to World War II was radio. It was a kind of emerging, you know, medium. You know, and as you're saying too, I mean, just film and moving images and the way, you know, this speed of how people took in.
And even the magazine was still pretty new, right? That was a pretty new item.
Yeah, there were stories about, you know, like, you know, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and people weren't aware of it until they went and saw the newsreel before the movie. You know, they didn't maybe get it from, you know, the newspaper or something like that, but once they saw it on film and the newsreel, you know, then, oh my goodness, you know. But we get to the 60s, you know, assassination, JFK, and people are like, I know, right, you know, where I was when that happened, because of this speed of, you know, television, you know, and people being able to vicariously kind of experience that through those kind of medium. And so what we see is that, again, that kind of emerging technology with ISIS, the internet, particularly social media, and they were, you know, one of the first most successful groups to understand how they could project this kind of outsized image of themselves through that medium, and kind of found the ways in which to, you know, push their message out and get it to circulate and get the most clicks, and, you know, and then the broadcast media, in the absence of reliable reporting, in this situation that was so dangerous you couldn't even get. I mean, there were news agencies.
That's the major component.
Yeah, that were saying, don't even go there. It's too dangerous. And so in that vacuum, how do you fill those screens? How do you tell this story? what the broadcast media began to use was ISIS's own propaganda. So you saw these images of trucks with, ISIS flags, driving in lines, and of course it's still projecting the same, message that they wanted initially, even though you may say, oh no, this is scary and this is bad, but what is it? It's projecting this image of strength that is, well larger than what...
That's the main component. Let's go back to that main component that first, in order for your propaganda to be the only information that anyone gets across the nation, across the world, is that you have to make it too dangerous of a territory for, independent news journalism to go there, right? So you cut off that element that like, nobody's here witnessing this but us, so we can say whatever we want about it.
Yeah.
Is this really like the first time in history you see that happening? Is this, where does that happen before this ISIS mechanism of doing that, of like creating, eliminating journalism, as...
I think that, I wouldn't say it's the first time. I think that, probably one of, the kind of best examples prior to this it would be World War I, in the fact that because it was such a broadcast culture, individual countries and they could control their messages a lot more simply in a sense. They didn't have to contend with, a distributed, diffused kind of network. But so there was propaganda on all sides, and I think that that's really evident. You see in whether it's the reporting from different countries at that time, or just the kind of internal propaganda campaigns from other different countries involved in that, and what are their goals, or what are they what are they
what reaction are they looking for,
fighting for, how are they getting people on their side, so
target audiences.
Yeah, it was, and I think that especially in that early broadcast culture, still radio was emerging, film was still emerging, not nearly what we think of as cinema today.
Well, I remember learning in Photography 101 in college that I had this incredible professor, and one of the things that I remember from that course is that photography's earliest use, besides memento mori photography, right, was the evidence of manifest destiny, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Documenting manifest destiny, and and that was the big purpose, and that's where they thought photography was going to go.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, you make it. I think that brings us back to kind of landscape and how we understand. The Department of War after the Civil War, sent photographers out to document the West, in ways that we could go and claim it, as you said, manifest destiny. And even before that, you can think about painting and the landscape, the Hudson River School. They were going with surveyor crews, so they're like, oh, look at the oxbow, we could own this, it was basically.
And now we do.
Yeah, propaganda for the bankers saying, how can we expand, but they're amazing, beautiful landscapes that, show that kind of untouched wilderness before we expanded.
How many people kind of feel like when you are consuming your news that you don't really know what's reliable and what's not? Like, do people have mistrust of what the information that they're getting? In general, pretty much everybody. Like, nobody feels 100% sure that what they're reading or what they're watching is the truth, right?
Depending on the source.
So how do you determine if a source is legitimate? Like what are the signs of knowing that your news source is legitimate?
I don't think there are signs.
There aren't signs. Okay, so you have to, I want to talk about that. Like
Sure.
you hear these terms, the media, right? Like, what does that mean? What's the media? Like journalism, press, Like those three terms, like I want to define the difference between those.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, so the media, of course, is the kind of large sphere, and it can encompass everything from journalism, reality TV, social media, like that is the kind of large, umbrella.
The visual digital world.
Yeah.
With information.
Yeah.
Okay. So like Oprah's the media.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
The Kardashians.
The Kardashians are the
Are
media.
the media,
CNN is the media.
Yeah, CNN's the media, and Fox News is the media. It encompasses all of that. I mean, the press is in general, the reporting, but of course there's also a mix between in the press of reporting and opinion,
Okay.
and especially like the 24-hour news networks, rely a lot on opinion. Because, they may be talking about things 24 hours a day that are happening in real time, and so they have to have people say, well, what do you think?
Right, right.
And so there's often a mix between, objective fact that can be verified and opinion.
Okay.
And then,
That's where things get dicey.
yeah, and journalists, in general, are looking to find that objective fact in the story.
They have ethics.
Yes, they should have ethics. And so that's the goal.
So maybe when I'm watching news or I'm reading something in the news, because the news is the paper's the media too, right?
Yeah.
I have to see if I have to ask myself if what I'm reading allows me to form my own opinion about that fact. Right? Is this actually a fact, or am I reading someone's opinion that's trying to sway my perspective and convince me that that's the fact?
Yeah.
Right? So that's a really lot of responsibility on people.
It is. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And I think that it is, kind of learning to read critically is important. Trying to, be able to parse out what is opinion, what is fact, what is, is it something that can be verifiable from, a number of sources? It's some of the recommendations to be able to, navigate those things is, making sure that you're having kind of a news diet that's varied, not in one column or another.
That's a good.
Yeah.
That's a good way to. That's a good perspective. Have a news diet that's varied.
Yeah. So, I think.
Not based on algorithms.
Yeah, well, and that is the thing. Especially now, talking about emerging technologies and like AI and the fact that like we have, taken apart in these systems, whether they are like algorithms and things like that. That I like that, I like that, I like that. Okay, I'll just show you that. I'll just show you that. I'll just show you that, and it walls us off into, it doesn't give us that kind of very
World perspective.
diet,
I remember when I moved to Italy and started knowing Italian enough to like listen to the news, which was really hard. It's really hard to listen to the news in a foreign language. But, I started getting to that point where I could, and I was like, wow, the stuff they were talking about, like, I had no idea that things like that were going on in the world. Like they're talking about, and I'm not saying that their news is better news or anything like that, but they just had like a whole different slew of things that they were talking about that we just never ever talked about. And one of the things when I first moved to Italy, we just went after Saddam Hussein. Like they sent the first troops in, and the Pope, I was in Rome, and the Pope was talking against going into this war, that it was, inhumane and don't do it, and America think twice and all this stuff. And so the Pope was like an advocate for us not to go after and enter that problem. And then we did. And 3 days later, there were 6 American soldiers across the front page of every newspaper, the first American captives. And I'm calling friends at home, and I'm like, oh God, this is so tragic. They're like, what? What? Nobody knew about it, that these 6 American soldiers, and here they had, they were pointing out like 3 of them were minorities and 2 of them were women, and blah blah. They were like making this huge deal about our soldiers being captured, and nobody in the United States knew about it. I'm like, okay, you know, so
Um,
it's just really, really selective what we get to know.
Yeah, it's true. And I mean, it was one of the issues that I kind of confronted initially when taking on this project, was just that notion of objectivity. And obviously that's the goal in journalism, if you're just trying to report, just the facts. But objectivity can be a contentious kind of issue because we all, come to things with our own preconceived notions and biases and things like that. And sometimes it's just a cultural frame or things like that that we can't necessarily, unless it's brought to our attention, see outside of. But it's really important that we try to do that. And part of it is just by engaging with, perspectives other than your own, and trying to really understand them. And the other thing is also just getting down to, and this is what, in the end became kind of my standard for objectivity within this work, is like, what is verifiable, objectively verifiable by multiple sources. And I worked really hard, especially in the language, in the timeline,
Right.
to make sure that anything that was stated was objectively verifiable by multiple sources. I was
Right.
trying to,
That's a lot of work.
I was trying to take out as much of my own bias or frame or perspective as possible, and just, this is just the facts.
Right.
This is what they said, this was their motivations, this is what happened next, this is what happened here, and
It's
try-
very sober, the language
Yeah.
that you use. It's very sober. There's no, flashy words or anything
Yeah.
like that. It's very respectful. And I think that brings the reader, the viewer, to a place of reverence, because there is a victim here.
Mhm.
There's a human being with a family
Yeah.
that were really not part of this, maybe these two gentlemen here, they were actually, in military activities, but for the rest of them, they were really just like a cab driver and
Yeah.
delivering supplies and,
trying to do humanitarian work,
a journalist.
trying to report on the, what's going
Right,
on.
so they weren't really, like in the argument itself, and yet
No.
they paid the biggest price, and in a really terrible way. It does memorialize this. I want to talk a little bit about, we've had several reactions from people that have come to see the show, and I know that this is not an easy show, and it's summer, and, so I thank you for caring about it, and
I thank you
investing
too
in it.
for all coming and coming to this talk and coming to this exhibition and really trying to understand this work. I think that I am asking a lot, and I recognize that, and so I do appreciate you all taking the time. And
On the flip side of that coin, I do think it's really brave. It's a brave act as an artist to, and we've seen many artists become very, very successful, internationally exhibited, very well respected, taking on really the hardest stuff that we have to take on in this world. So I always think that that's a really brave act on an artist's part, because it is, maybe more fun to, just paint the beach. You know what I mean? Like, I've done paintings, just painting the beach, and that's really a lot of fun. So, I do commend you for that. But we've had a lot of reactions, and I'm really grateful to those reactions for people who have either a loved one or themselves a military experience. And they seem to just, for me, not need a lot of explanation. Like, they just recognize these landscapes, and they just recognize the inherent violence that is behind that, experientially.
yeah.
So, do you feel that veterans have a particular, reaction to this work? What's your experience of veterans and their relationship to the work?
Yeah, I would say so. This work has been exhibited in whole or in part in a number of different venues and a number of different exhibitions, and I would say I think that there is, exactly as you're saying, something to that. They do understand the inherent sacrifice,
Right.
Going into the most dangerous situation, trying to, get the job done as you're, being told, and, the protections that, I mean, fighting is, especially for the protections of a free press or things like that. There is, I think that they understand that sense of sacrifice. And so I have had a number of veterans who've become very moved by the work. And I think that, they do respond in that way.
And I think part of it is the sobriety with which you present it, is also a codus that veterans understand, saying things without being too forthcoming also, forthcoming in the sense of graphic.
Yeah.
So I want to say something a little dicey. Can I say something a little dicey? I was rereading these this morning, and I was thinking about the title, where it is a statement signed in blood, right?
Yes.
To the realm of Christ,
Yeah, from
right?
the Nations of the Cross or whatever.
To the Nations of the Cross.
Yeah.
And I had this thing pop in my head when I read that again this morning. A term, I had the idea of religious supremacy pop into my head, in the same sense of like white supremacy, right? That there's this, there's this concept of white supremacy, that whiteness is just superior in every way to any other beings and whatever. And in there, I'm just thinking about that Christian realm versus the Muslim realm, and that sense of religious supremacy.
Yeah, and I mean, again, this is propaganda, and they are trying to, put forward their worldview in all the ways that they're crafting the media that they're making, even just in that title. I mean, they're seeing, they were trying to frame what they were doing in this, kind of apocalyptic language of this clash of civilizations, between Christianity and Islam. So, I mean, yeah, I think, to your point, with reflecting on ideas of like white supremacy and, how that motivates people to do, terrible violence. I mean, I think that once you start kind of framing things in those terms, the propaganda allows, you to undertake, the unspeakable acts in furtherance of that cause. I mean, you actually see white supremacist groups who have learned from ISIS,
Right.
Whether it is like some of those techniques of hashtag hijacking, ways to insert your message into mainstream forms of conversation, to make them more palatable, to make them more noble, to make them, and again, it's propaganda. It is trying to put forward a worldview that is not, represented by and large, but how do you, use these kind of forms of media to insert your ideology. Right.
Ideology is the key word. I mean, for me, it kind of gave me a little bit of perspective to get that term in my head of, this is religious supremacy, right? To like give it that same sort of terminology as like white supremacy, which I understand in a really specific way. Because this kind of violence, I'm always like, how can people even do that? Like, there always comes that part. I mean, does that happen to you? Like, how did you as a human being decide that you were going to hold this person like that and inflict that kind of violence on them? Like, how can you, in your soul and in your morals, find any justification for that, And so,
and like the main narrator of, especially these initial videos, as the media dubbed him Jihadi John, he was a British citizen. He again, went to go join the caliphate. There's a reason why they chose him as the spokesperson. He's
the model.
Yeah, he is a Western person who's thrown off all of that. He's joined the cause. It's all very...
It's a recruitment effort in a certain way.
Yeah, it's all purposely crafted, to send a certain message.
Do you guys think it's helpful to understand propaganda in that way, or to understand this kind of imagery in those terms? That does the fact that it's like very specifically crafted, does that help you to kind of like interpret what you see?
My first impression of that in growing up was reading about the Crusades.
I was just thinking the same thing.
Crusades, and then immediately after that, the other, what's the other one called? The Spanish Inquisition.
Oh,
The
yeah.
Spanish Inquisition. These are people who had to create a big fat story about how it's going to be okay
Yeah.
to do what they specifically say should not be done.
Ordained by God.
Yeah. Well, and they were referencing the Crusades. They were, they were putting this in these kind of,
Yeah.
clash of civilization, kind of apocalyptic terms.
So was your whole point to strip this down, to get to the essence, get rid of all the, because this is the truth. This is the only thing we know is back, is that sand and that sagebrush, that ocean and those rocks. Was that kind of your point?
Well, yeah, I mean, in many ways, like.
I mean, there's arguments even that these were filmed on a green screen and then these landscapes.
And some of it was, I
Right.
mean, there have been people who've, dissected these, and have found, ways in which these were filmed, different techniques like green screen and superimposing was all put on. I mean, even you can look at the landscapes themselves and they have these they're not, if this was if I was just to go out and photograph this landscape, I would never photograph it in this way because there's this very shallow depth of field. It's kind of fuzzy, but that's because the figures, are the focus, not the landscape. But, I came to this work really just watching the news when this was all happening, and I really became very consumed by, the landscape. And it was the bright blue of the sky, and I was like, they're trying to tell us something. Initially, when I was watching this stuff, I couldn't put my finger on it. And I started kind of digging and looking and thinking, and then I did. I started all of these things that I could see were purposely crafted for our consumption, came to the fore. I saw, well, they're putting them in orange jumpsuits. They're trying to reference, how we're, holding prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. Again, they're just trying to make that visual connection. They're doing it in these landscapes. This is different than other, beheading videos from other terrorist organizations. They're not hiding away in some,
bunker.
Yeah, bunker with a flag behind them or whatever. They are saying we are out in the open and we control this territory. So I just started, the more I started thinking about what we were seeing, the more I understood what kind of message they were trying to send. And so then I was like, well, how does one address this without either being inflammatory on the other side or highlighting their message again? So that became kind of the biggest challenge for me, is how do I say something that really speaks to the constructed nature of this, how we can think critically about these kinds of images when they hit us, and not reinforce their own propaganda. So it was a real challenge.
Humanity in their pictures, but there was an absence of human empathy.
Yeah. I think that's
the most striking absence that there is in all of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that, you're absolutely right.
That goes back to what I was saying, is this is really helpful to give me some language in my own mind to answer my own question of just how could you actually just do that? I have trouble killing a spider. I have to get a glass and put it outside. I'm like, sorry, buddy, and I smack it. You know what I mean? Like, thank you for your life. You know, I mean, so like, it's really, really shocking to me that people have. You know, I'm still struggling with that. You know, this is within the human character to do that. You know,
But the humans in there were not human to them.
right,
No.
right.
And that's and like I said, I wanted to kind of bring back some dignity to these people, to their lives, to, you know, their own empathy that they're coming to these, you know, horrible situations. They're like, you know, aid workers, I want to help, you know, journalists, I just want to tell people what's going on, you know, and so I did want to honor and memorialize those victims, you know, but also, you know, try to make this other point about, like, you know, how do we critically read these things, especially, you know, it's so important now. I mean, there's discussions about, like, we're living in a post-truth society. You know, truth is you know.
Well, there's alternative truths.
Yeah, there's alternative facts, and there's, you know, and so. But how do we read critically? How do we, you know, it's important for us to be able to, you know, consume and understand media and understand what's going on in our world. But, you know, how do we do that critically and have an understanding of the
Well, and there's
the
that
facts?
idea of do your own research, right? Okay, and a lot of people who say that do your own research are right for the wrong reasons, but, you know, I mean, doing your own research really is a huge effort, right?
Yeah, it is.
You have to actually, like you did here, go to multiple sources and be able to confirm that,
Yeah.
you know, in a non-objective way on multiple different fronts.
Yeah.
And then that's doing your own research,
Yeah.
right?
20 years ago, when we were living in Rome, there was a photography exhibit in Rome in a huge space. And it struck me going in like, oh, he's born the same time as me, this guy.
Yeah.
And he was a famous British photographer who spent his entire life photographing the latest war.
Oh,
He kept track. He went to all the wars that occurred, which was a lot. And looking at that, and I would remember things, you know, like, oh yeah.
And the exhibit created a timeline of those wars,
Yeah.
and just kind of
Oh,
like
wow.
brought home that like we're always in a war.
It was
There's not a time
wonderful.
period without a war.
And it was such an important piece of photography as far as I was concerned to begin to understand that this is a human condition. This is going on all the time. I mean, I was, you know, it was how many wars since then, since I saw that, you know.
Yeah.
It's a very important kind of documentation.
It is.
Because
And
nobody's not involved, you know. It happens to everybody sooner or later.
yeah. And that's why, I mean, the work of journalists is so important, and
Yeah.
war correspondents and you know, documentary photographers.
Yes, it was so powerful.
Yeah, because without them, we wouldn't be able to, you know, understand
To
what is
understand the big picture.
Yeah, what is the big picture? What is the ground
The
of
big picture
truth?
is there's always a war going on. I mean, that sounds very, you know, negative, but
Are there any other questions or comments for Brandon?
Well, I just have one more I don't know if other people have experienced this, but when I've gone to Civil War battlefields, I feel like there's an aura. Like there's, honestly, their spirits are still there.
Yeah.
And I just thank them in my head for what they did.
Yeah.
Because I'm able to be there on a beautiful sunshiny day, see the beauty around and breathe.
Yeah.
And I believe if somebody even went to these places, they would feel the spirit of those people.
Yeah.
So in a way, I think that's a way to remember them.
Yeah.
You know, and I appreciate that you told their story
Well, thank you.
so that we would know. And now we can walk out into the sunshine and even, you know, because that's part of the world.
Yeah.
You know, we're in this little bubble and you're talking about it, but it's all around it and we can't ignore it
Yeah,
because we're in Door County and it's a beautiful day.
right.
Yeah.
And so anyway.
I appreciate that comment. I really do. That's wonderful.
And it kind of goes back to my idea about this landscape not being consensual. The landscape
Yeah.
cannot consent, and yet that becomes the experience, you know, or other experience, but that landscape is permanently stained with this story and this activity, this event, right? So, you know, the landscape doesn't have a choice in that, right? It just, whatever we decide to do in it is what happens to it, you know.
There's a question over here.
I'm curious as to how what you have presented here translates to the statements on climate change.
Oh, yeah. Well, so the work that's in the West Gallery is kind of putting this in context in some ways. So, you know, there's a couple video pieces in here that are some early works of mine from a video sketchbook series from 2006. There's the central video installation, which again is this kind of reflection on the media, trying to think kind of critically about the implied narratives that, you know, we can be told through the media. And then the work related to climate change, in a similar way to the video installation, I photographed news broadcasts related to climate change from all kinds of different news sources. And I did it with a long shutter speed so that you get kind of that mix and blur of the editing as the moving images were kind of proceeding. And so that work in particular is drawn from a kind of larger installation that was related to climate change and trying to think more deeply about climate change, where it started, our effect on the earth. And so, again, I think that's a reflection on media, similarly, but media specifically related to climate change.
When we first met, one of the first conversations we had was about the Anthropocene, right? And the Anthropocene, I want you to talk a little bit about the Anthropocene and what is the marcation of that, and what that term is really saying.
Sure, yeah, and so like I said, that work came from, I did a whole sabbatical project that ended up in an exhibition called Fragments of the Acceleration. And it was looking at the Anthropocene, the notion of the Anthropocene, which is like the kind of human affected environment. And geologists mark the Anthropocene at the time of all of the above ground nuclear tests in the 40s and 50s, because you can, in the strata of geology, you can find that kind of radiological signature around the globe, because that, you know, the way that air currents and things like that, you know, that can be detected as a very specific kind of layer in our Earth's history that's easy to locate around the globe. And so, previous to that, I've done a lot of work relating to looking at nuclear abolition and things like that. And so this work kind of started at that point, looking at that and then trying to see from that point, you know, how are we, you know, affecting our Earth, and what are the, you know, consequences, and what are the ways in which we can kind of move forward.
And this is the first geological strata that is created by a living creature on the planet, right?
Yeah.
So, like, everything else was a natural event of the actual, you know, inanimate land, right? The landscape, so, or space, or whatever it is, right? So it's, you know, the chemical reactions of the planet, right, that have created the geological strata up until now.
And if we go back to, you know, I talked about Susan Kite, the Lakota artist who I had speak to my class last semester. If you think about the land as this, like, living entity that tells stories, I mean, geologists would tell you the same thing. I mean, we look at, you know, the geological strata, And there are stories there. There are stories about, the past. And, we have written our own story already into the geological strata. And so it's a really heavy thing to consider, but, it also gives us a great responsibility.
And again, I'm going to go back to my 101 classes in college, and I was taking like earth science or something of that sort. And one of the things that stuck with me was the teacher's assistant saying, if you think about time as the human body, like all of time, right? That humans are like a fingernail clipping in that timeline.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if anybody's been to the Field Museum recently down in Chicago, but they have a really amazing, kind of timeline that you walk through of, kind of Earth's history. It's really powerful.
One of my favorite museums.
Yeah.
Any other questions, you guys?
What are you doing next?
Yeah.
Well, I have a lot of projects going on right now. So I teach at St. Norbert College, and I have a number. Well, I have a number. First, I have a number of exhibits that are coming up. I'll be exhibiting in a space in De Pere that's a newer space, a new art space downtown De Pere, and that will be opening in August, and that's going to be highlighting the work of myself and other St. Norbert College faculty. In the fall, I'm teaching a course that is about art and democracy, and I'm going to be curating an exhibition with a Chicago-based artist in our galleries, which will be looking at ways that artists kind of investigate critically ideas of democracy and things like that. And I'll be hosting
And who's the artist from Chicago?
Aramhan Cifuentes.
Okay.
She's really amazing. I think she is originally, if I'm not mistaken, I know West Coast, I think it was LA, originally from LA. She does these like multi-generational sewing circles. She has this project she calls the Protest Banner Lending Library, that she has people do these kind of community banner builds and things like that. And then she lends them out, and people can use them, to decorate their wall or go to a protest or things like that. We're going to do a banner build at St. Norbert that's going to be a part of our S&C Get Out the Vote efforts and things like that. So she does some, and she looks a lot at disenfranchisement and how people have a political voice. She does a really fantastic project called the Citizenship Test Sampler, where she has newly immigrated communities make these like little cross stitches of the questions from the U.S. Citizenship Test Sampler, and then she sells them, each individual piece, for the price that it costs to take the test. So then she can continually sponsor people to get their citizenship test. So she's really fantastic. I'm excited to work with her. We're also going to be doing a kind of community engaged project with the Coalition of Voting Organizations of Brown County, and do some Get Out the Vote efforts, bringing creativity to those efforts. So, yeah.
You know the artist Landscapes?
Yeah.
Okay.
I love his work.
Yeah. Is he still alive?
I'm not sure. I believe he is. I know that a couple of years ago he just had a big retrospective at the new museum. So I believe he still is alive, but he may be one of those that.
I did a paper on him.
Yeah. Oh,
years
did
ago.
you?
Yeah.
Oh, I love his work. Yeah. Yeah, he's fantastic. He's there's many ways.
Really interesting guy.
Yeah. And again, just really thinking critically and
Yeah.
conceptually about, especially democracy.
Yeah.
Well, Brandon, I can't let you get away. It is the studio door, and there's one question that I ask everybody who comes as a guest on the studio door, so I'm going to toss that at you.
Okay.
What advice do you have for young artists, particularly using digital media in your case, that are looking to have a career or build a career and tackle the big issues the way you are doing? What advice do you have for them?
Well, like I said, I mean, I think that, you know, kind of any artist practice comes down to some of those foundational, you know, ideas. And as I said, I mean, my firm belief is that, you know, the two kind of main things that, you know, really need to impress upon artists is observation and critique, you know. And so whether it is just like, you know, observing a flower and painting it, you know, with, you know, fidelity or expression or whatever, or observing, you know, the media and being critical about it, I think that observation and critique are kind of the core of what is an artist practice, you know, across the board.
That's good advice. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Brandon, for being here.